In the suffocating heat of late summer 1928, the Blackwater Mire stretched endlessly across southern Louisiana, its tea-colored waters concealing secrets that decent folk preferred to forget. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient cypress trees, and somewhere in that maze of channels and rotting vegetation, something had been feeding. The confession arrived years later, scrawled in shaking handwriting on paper, stained with what might have been tears or sweat. "We didn't kill them," the letter began. "We just fed them to what was already hungry." The words belonged to Silas Crow, an escaped convict who claimed he and his brother had discovered a family in the depths of the swamp, a family with appetites that went far beyond what God intended. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. According to Silas, they had stumbled upon the Vaudrys, a clan who lured desperate travelers to their stilt house compound with promises of shelter, only to serve them as the main course at their next family meal. But when the brothers realized they were intended as the next victims, they turned the Bayou's own predators against their captors, systematically feeding an entire family of cannibals to the alligators that prowled those dark waters. This was not just survival. This was an operation that fed on human lives for decades. The letter that would become the foundation of Louisiana's most disturbing legend arrived at St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans on a gray February morning in 1929. Father James Morrison later described the handwriting as the desperate scrawl of a man unburdening his soul, though he could never verify if the writer was truly seeking absolution or simply trying to justify the unjustifiable. Silas Crow identified himself as an escaped convict, a man who had fled into the Blackwater Mire with his younger brother Elijah after a prison transport accident the previous summer. What they found in those trackless waters, according to his testimony, challenged every assumption about the limits of human depravity. The Vaudry clan, he wrote, had perfected a system of luring lost souls to their compound, a floating abattoir disguised as a haven for desperate men. The letter's most chilling passage described their final night in the compound. "The old woman sharpened her cleaver while humming a lullaby," Silas wrote. "She told Elijah he was good stock, strong meat that would feed the family for days. That's when I knew we had to become something worse than them to survive." But survival, according to Silas, was only the beginning. The brothers had discovered evidence of dozens of previous victims, personal belongings stored like trophies in a hidden trunk beneath the main house. Faced with the certainty that the killing would continue long after their own deaths, they made a decision that would haunt them forever. They would ensure the Vaudry clan never claimed another victim. Not through escape, not through mercy, but through a justice as brutal and final as the Bayou itself. Using their knowledge of the swamp's apex predators, they systematically fed each member of the cannibal family to the alligators that had grown fat and complacent on the Vaudry's table scraps. The letter concluded with a question that still echoes through the humid air of southern Louisiana. Were we monsters for what we did, or were we the only ones with the courage to stop the real monsters? To understand this final justice, we must first go back to the beginning, to the night two desperate men vanished into the Blackwater Mire. The Blackwater Mire earned its name from waters so dark they seemed to absorb light itself, a sprawling wetland that stretched across 3 parishes in southern Louisiana like a wound that refused to heal. Unlike the tourist-friendly bayous closer to New Orleans, this was a place where civilization had tried and failed to take hold, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of failed lumber operations and the kind of isolation that bred its own peculiar horrors. At the Mire's eastern edge sat Desolate Point, a company town that had outlived its purpose when the cypress timber ran out in 1926. By the time the Crow brothers arrived, fewer than 200 souls remained, most too poor or too stubborn to abandon the rotting houses and empty storefronts that lined the single muddy road. Those who stayed spoke of the deeper swamp in hushed, contradictory whispers, some claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of loggers who had vanished in its depths, others insisting that living things far worse than ghosts still called it home. Old Man Finch, a trapper who worked the Myers' outer channels, kept a diary that survives to this day. His entries from 1928 paint a picture of a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human presence. "The water don't reflect right," he wrote in July of that year. "Looks like it's got depth where there ain't none and shallows that'll swallow a man whole. The gators here are different too, bigger and meaner, like they've been feeding on more than fish and turtles." The geography itself conspired to hide secrets. Channels that appeared on survey maps had vanished, replaced by impenetrable walls of sawgrass and thorny vines. Islands that seemed solid from a distance revealed themselves to be floating masses of vegetation that could support a man's weight for minutes before collapsing into the tea-colored depths below. Navigation required an intimate knowledge of landmarks that shifted with the seasons, cypress trees that might be there one year and gone the next, claimed by floods or rot or the simple hunger of the swamp to reclaim what humanity had tried to tame. It was into this watery labyrinth that the Crow brothers fled, following channels that grew narrower and more treacherous with each mile. They were not the first desperate men to seek refuge in the Blackwater mire, nor would they be the last. But unlike those who had come before, they would not simply vanish without a trace. This was the world the Crow brothers entered, and the world the Vaudry clan had mastered. The Vaudry compound rose from the dark waters like something from a fever dream. A collection of weathered buildings connected by narrow walkways and supported by cypress pilings that had been carved and notched with symbols that seemed to predate any known Louisiana tradition. From a distance, it appeared to be a typical Bayou settlement, the kind of isolated homestead where French Acadian families had eked out livings for generations. Only upon closer inspection did the subtle wrongness become apparent. Jean-Pierre Vaudry presented himself as the patriarch of this floating community, a man whose courtly manners and soft-spoken French accent masked eyes that seemed to catalog the weight and value of everyone who entered his domain. Standing well over 6 feet tall despite his advanced age, he moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous ground. His most distinctive feature was his left hand, which was missing the ring and middle fingers, leaving only a thumb, index finger, and pinky that he used to gesture with theatrical flourishes while speaking. Tante Eloise, the clan's matriarch, ruled the compound's kitchen with an authority that brooked no interference. Her domain extended across 2 buildings connected by a covered walkway, one serving as a traditional cooking space and the other housing what appeared to be a smokehouse of unusual dimensions. She rarely spoke to outsiders, communicating instead through meaningful looks and the constant rhythmic sound of her cleaver against the scarred wooden block that dominated her workspace. Her apron, according to Silas Crow's letter, was never truly clean, bearing stains that seemed to have been worked into the fabric through years of use. The family's public face was Abel Vaudry, Jean-Pierre's nephew and the member most likely to encounter travelers on the waterways surrounding the compound. Unlike his relatives, Abel possessed a conventional handsomeness that made him appear trustworthy to desperate men. His role, according to the brothers' later testimony, was to serve as a lure, guiding lost souls to the compound with promises of food, shelter, and safe passage through the treacherous waters of the deeper swamp. But it was the silent members of the family who left the deepest impression on visitors. 3 or possibly 4 cousins, pale and hulking men who communicated through glances and gestures handled the compound's heavy labor with an efficiency that suggested years of practice. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in a dialect so thick with Acadian French and local patois that even native Louisiana speakers struggled to understand them. These were the men who maintained the walkways, tended the boats, and performed the countless tasks that kept the floating settlement operational. The compound itself reflected the family's peculiar needs. Guest quarters were located in a separate building, connected to the main house by a single narrow walkway that could be easily monitored or blocked. The buildings showed signs of constant modification and repair, with rooms that seemed to serve no obvious purpose and storage spaces that were kept locked even from casual observation. To the weary brothers, it must have seemed a miracle, but miracles in the swamp often have a dark price. The brothers' first night in the Vaudry compound passed without incident, a mercy they would later recognize as calculated rather than fortunate. Exhausted from their flight through the swamp and weakened by Silas's infected leg wound, they slept the deep sleep of men who had found sanctuary after days of mortal terror. But even unconsciousness could not completely shield them from the subtle wrongness that permeated the floating settlement. Elijah woke sometime after midnight to sounds that had no place in a normal household. A rhythmic scraping accompanied by soft splashing that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the guest quarters. Through the thin walls, he could hear movement in the main house, footsteps that moved with purpose rather than the random wandering of someone unable to sleep. When he pressed his ear to the floor, the sounds became clearer, a series of impacts that suggested heavy objects being dragged across rough surfaces. Dawn brought explanations that were just plausible enough to quiet his suspicions. The night sounds, Jean-Pierre explained over a breakfast of thick coffee and cornbread, were simply the normal activities of a family that lived by the rhythms of the Bayou rather than the clock. Fish had to be cleaned when they were caught, regardless of the hour. Boats required constant maintenance to remain seaworthy in the corrosive environment of the swamp. The tides and currents that governed their lives paid no attention to human schedules. But walking the compound's narrow walkways in the bright morning light, Elijah discovered evidence that challenged these reasonable explanations. Half buried in the mud beneath the main house's kitchen, he found a tarnished silver locket bearing the initials MR and containing a photograph of a young woman whose face bore no resemblance to any member of the Vaudry clan. When he brought his discovery to Jean-Pierre, the patriarch examined it with the careful attention of a man accustomed to handling such questions. The locket, he explained, had belonged to a previous guest, a traveling salesman who had departed several weeks earlier after losing most of his possessions in a poker game with the family. Such carelessness was common among men who ventured into the deeper swamp without proper preparation. The photograph was probably of a sweetheart or sister, a keepsake the man had been forced to abandon along with his other valuables. These things happened frequently in a place where survival took precedence over sentiment. Sheriff John Thoreau's logbook, discovered years later in the basement of the Desolate Point Courthouse, contains an entry dated September 12, 1928, that provides additional context for such disappearances. Abel Vaudry reports missing travelers, the entry reads. Claims they vanished near Gators Bend. No search party mobilized due to dangerous conditions, and likelihood subjects departed area voluntarily. The explanation was just plausible enough, a thread of doubt the brothers could cling to for now. But the locket remained in Elijah's pocket, a talisman against the growing certainty that their sanctuary was something far more sinister than it appeared. The chain that had bound Silas Crow to his fellow prisoners bore links forged in the state penitentiary's own smithy, each one designed to hold men whose desperation had already proven stronger than society's ability to contain them. when the transport wagon overturned on a rain-slicked road outside Baton Rouge on July 28, 1928. 3 men died instantly, crushed beneath the weight of oak and iron. 5 others suffered injuries that ended their attempts to escape before they had properly begun. Only Silas and his younger brother Elijah possessed both the strength to break free and the knowledge of Louisiana's wilderness necessary to disappear into the maze of waterways that stretched south toward the Gulf. The desolate Point Ledger's coverage of the escape filled less than 2 column inches on page 3, a brief notice warning local residents to secure their properties and report any suspicious activity to the authorities. What the newspaper did not report was the nature of the crime that had earned the brothers their sentences, a distinction that would prove relevant to their later actions in the Blackwater mire. Silas had been convicted of assault with intent to kill, charges stemming from his violent response to discovering his employer's treatment of migrant workers on a rice plantation outside Lake Charles. The victims of his rage had survived, but barely, and the testimony at his trial painted a picture of a man whose sense of justice operated outside the bounds of civilized society. Elijah's crimes were less dramatic but more telling, a series of thefts and confidence games that had targeted the wealthy and corrupt, with a precision that suggested careful planning and an intimate understanding of human weakness. Their flight into the swamp began as a tactical retreat, but gradually transformed into something approaching despair. Silas's leg, gashed open during the wagon accident, had become infected despite Elijah's attempts to treat it with swamp mud and stolen medical supplies. By the time they encountered Abel Vaudry on the waterway leading toward the deeper mire, they were no longer fugitives but refugees, men whose options had narrowed to acceptance of whatever mercy the wilderness might provide. Abel found them, according to his own later account, collapsed in their stolen pirogue near a channel marker that local trappers called the Devil's Elbow. The younger Crow brother was delirious with fever, calling out names that made no sense and begging forgiveness from people who existed only in his fevered imagination. Silas remained conscious but was clearly in no condition to continue their flight without medical attention and proper food. The offer of sanctuary came with conditions that seemed reasonable to men in their desperate circumstances. The Vaudry compound operated outside the normal channels of law and commerce, a place where questions about a man's past were considered both impolite and irrelevant. In exchange for temporary shelter and medical care, the brothers would contribute their labor to the family's various enterprises, helping with repairs, fishing, and the countless tasks required to maintain a settlement in one of Louisiana's most hostile environments. For men with no options, the Vaudry's hospitality was a lifeline, one they dared not question. The alternative was death in the swamp, a fate that seemed increasingly likely with each hour that passed without proper treatment for Silas's infected wound. The realization of their true situation came to the brothers in fragments, pieces of a horrifying puzzle that their minds initially refused to assemble into a coherent picture. The Vaudry compound operated with an efficiency that spoke of years of refinement, a system designed to process human beings with the same methodical precision that other families applied to livestock or commercial fishing. Abel's role as the family's lure had been perfected through countless encounters with desperate travelers. His appearance on the waterways was never accidental, but carefully timed to coincide with the movements of men who had reasons to avoid official channels. Escaped convicts, army deserters, and migrants fleeing debt or violence found themselves guided to the compound by a young man whose genuine concern for their welfare masked purposes that were anything but charitable. Before we continue deeper into this nightmare, I need to ask something of you. If you're finding value in these stories of forgotten horrors, If you believe the truth deserves to be told, no matter how disturbing it might be, then subscribe to this channel, because what we're about to uncover goes beyond simple murder into territory that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The guest quarters where the brothers had been housed showed signs of careful design rather than simple hospitality. The single entrance could be barricaded from the outside with a heavy wooden beam that fit into iron brackets mounted on the doorframe. The windows, while large enough to provide adequate light and ventilation, were too small and too high to serve as escape routes for anyone larger than a child. Most telling were the stains on the wooden floor, dark patches that had been scrubbed repeatedly but never completely removed. Tante Eloise's domain extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of a Bayou kitchen. Her smokehouse contained racks and hooks designed to handle cuts of meat far larger than anything that could be obtained from local wildlife. The tools of her trade included implements that had no place in conventional food preparation, devices whose purpose became clear only when viewed in the context of the family's true business. Her constant humming while she worked took on a sinister quality when the brothers realized she was usually preparing for the arrival of new guests. The silent cousins who handled the compound's heavy labor possessed a strength and coordination that suggested years of practice in tasks that required both physical power and absolute discretion. Their boats were equipped with weights and chains that served no obvious purpose in normal fishing or trapping activities. Their knowledge of the deepest channels and most isolated islands in the Blackwater Mire allowed them to dispose of evidence in waters that would never give up their secrets to casual investigation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Vaudry operation was its integration with the local ecosystem. The alligators that prowled the waters around the compound had been conditioned to associate the sound of human activity with the promise of food. They gathered at feeding times like domestic animals, their patience and predictability transforming them from wild predators into living waste disposal units. The horrifying machine was all around them, and they were already inside it. The brothers' growing awareness of their situation was matched only by their understanding that escape would require them to become something as monstrous as their captors. Elijah's fever returned on their 5th night in the compound, a resurgence of the illness that had nearly killed him during their flight through the swamp. His delirium provided Tante Eloise with an opportunity to display the kind of maternal concern that might have seemed touching in any other context. She tended to him with practiced efficiency, applying cool cloths to his burning forehead and spooning broth between his cracked lips with the patience of a woman accustomed to caring for the helpless. But her whispered reassurances carried undertones that chilled Silas more than his brother's fever. "Such a strong one," she murmured in her mixture of French and English, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a craftsman evaluating premium materials. "Good stock, healthy muscle. The family will feast for days when the time comes." Her words were accompanied by touches that seemed to catalog the meat on Elijah's bones, professional assessments disguised as gestures of comfort. While his brother received this disturbing care, Silas used his greater mobility to explore the compound's outer boundaries, ostensibly searching for medicinal plants that might aid in Elijah's recovery. His real purpose was to gather intelligence about their captors and identify potential escape routes, a mission that brought him to the edge of the Vaudry property, and an encounter that would confirm his darkest suspicions. Old Man Finch worked a trapline that skirted the compound's northern boundary, a series of carefully placed snares and deadfalls that provided him with the pelts and meat that sustained his solitary existence in the deeper swamp. The old trapper had learned to avoid direct contact with the Vaudry clan, but his proximity to their operations made him an unwitting witness to activities that violated every standard of human decency. Silas observed Finch from concealment as the old man checked his traps, listening to a monologue that seemed to be addressed to the swamp itself rather than any human audience. "Been too quiet over there lately," Finch muttered as he reset a spring-loaded snare. "Usually hear them working at night, cleaning and chopping, getting ready for the next batch of poor souls. But it's been silent as a tomb for 3 days now." The old man's assessment of the situation carried the authority of someone who had observed the Vaudry's operations for years without fully understanding their nature. "God help any soul they drag back to that larder of theirs," he continued, unaware that his words were being overheard by one of those very souls. "That family ain't right, never has been. They take in strays like they're doing Christian charity, but the strays never seem to leave again." Finch's diary, discovered after his death from natural causes several years later, contained entries that provided additional context for his observations. October 15th, 1828, one entry read, "Saw smoke from the Vaudry place today, thick and black like they're burning more than just wood. The smell carried all the way to my camp, sweet and sick-making. Whatever they're disposing of, it ain't normal trash." The word larder echoed in Silas's mind, snapping the final piece of the nightmare into place. The Vaudry compound was not a refuge, but a slaughterhouse, and he and his brother were not guests, but livestock being fattened for the family's table. Knowledge brought with it the terrible burden of choice. Silas could continue to pretend that his suspicions were the product of paranoia and desperation, maintaining the comfortable fiction that had allowed him to sleep peacefully for nearly a week. Or he could pursue the truth with the understanding that confirmation would transform their sanctuary into a prison from which escape might prove impossible. The decision was made for him by Elijah's deteriorating condition. His brother's fever had broken, but the delirium had been replaced by a listless weakness that made him vulnerable to whatever fate the Vaudrys had planned. If they were to have any chance of survival, Silas needed to understand exactly what they were facing and how the family's operation functioned. His investigation began in the guest quarters themselves, a systematic search that revealed details he had overlooked during their first desperate nights in the compound. The wooden walls bore scratches that might have been made by fingernails, deep gouges that suggested desperate attempts to claw through solid cypress planks. The floor showed signs of repeated scrubbing, but careful examination revealed stains that had penetrated too deeply into the wood to be completely removed. But the most damning evidence lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the room's single window. The space contained a collection of personal belongings that represented dozens of previous guests, items too valuable or too distinctive to be casually discarded. Wedding rings and pocket watches, folding knives and fountain pens, photographs and letters that testified to the lives and loves of men who had sought sanctuary in the Blackwater mire and found only death. Among these grim trophies was a child's wooden doll, carved with the skill of a craftsman and painted with the kind of care that spoke of deep affection. Its presence suggested that the Vaudry's victims had not been limited to the desperate men who typically sought refuge in the deeper swamp. Families had been processed through this floating abattoir, parents and children alike, contributing to the clan's systematic feast. The discovery that sealed their fate lay beneath the main house, accessible through a trapdoor hidden behind Tante Eloise's massive cooking stove. The space below had been modified to serve as a processing facility, equipped with drainage systems and specialized tools that left no doubt about its purpose. The floor was constructed of closely fitted cypress planks that could be hosed clean after use, while a series of pulleys and hooks allowed for the efficient handling of large, heavy objects. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the hidden chamber was its obvious age. The modifications to the space showed signs of decades of use, suggesting that the Vaudry operation had been claiming victims since long before the brothers' arrival. The walls bore stains that had built up in layers over years of systematic use, creating a patina of horror that spoke to the industrial scale of the family's activities. They knew the truth, but with discovery came a new terror. They had just signed their own death warrants. The Vaudrys had allowed them to recover from their ordeal not out of mercy, but out of practical considerations. Sick men made poor eating, but healthy ones who had regained their strength would provide the kind of quality meat that the family preferred. The brothers' situation required a response that went beyond simple escape. Even if they could somehow flee the compound without being detected by the ever-vigilant cousins, their flight would only delay the inevitable. The Vaudry possessed an intimate knowledge of the Blackwater mire that would allow them to track down any fugitives with relative ease. More importantly, their departure would do nothing to prevent future victims from suffering the same fate that awaited them. Silas possessed advantages that previous victims had lacked, skills acquired during his years as a farmhand and hunter that proved unexpectedly relevant to their current predicament. His conviction had resulted from his violent response to injustice, but the techniques he had learned in legitimate work could be adapted to serve darker purposes. The prison warden's report, filed as part of his official record, noted his preternatural skill with livestock and trapping, abilities that had made him valuable despite his criminal status. The alligators that patrolled the waters around the compound represented both a threat and an opportunity. Silas observed their behavior with the careful attention of a man whose survival depended on understanding predator patterns. The beasts had been conditioned by years of regular feeding to associate human activity with the promise of food. They gathered at predictable times and locations, their patience and reliability transforming them from wild animals into potential weapons. The compound's design, which seemed so well suited to containing unwilling guests, also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood its layout and limitations. The narrow walkways that connected the various buildings were supported by pilings that showed signs of age and water damage. The wooden structures themselves had been modified so many times over the years that their structural integrity had been compromised in ways that might not be immediately obvious to their inhabitants. But perhaps most importantly, the Vaudry's success had bred a complacency that made them vulnerable to the kind of systematic planning that had characterized their own operations. They were accustomed to dealing with desperate men who reacted to their situation with panic and fear rather than careful analysis. The possibility that their intended victims might possess the knowledge and determination to turn their own methods against them had never occurred to a family that had operated with impunity for decades. Silas's plan emerged gradually, shaped by his observations of the compound's daily routines and the behavior of both its human and reptilian inhabitants. The Vaudrys had created a system that functioned with mechanical precision, but systems could be disrupted by someone who understood their underlying logic. The family's own predatory efficiency would become the weapon used to destroy them. The trap was set not with rope and steel, but with the geography of the mire itself. The brothers would turn the Bayou's apex predators against their captors, ensuring that justice was delivered with the same brutal finality that the Vaudry had inflicted on their victims. The plan required precise timing and a willingness to embrace methods that would have horrified the brothers under normal circumstances. But survival in the Blackwater mire had already transformed them into something harder and more ruthless than the men who had fled into the swamp weeks earlier. The knowledge of what awaited them if they failed provided motivation that overrode any moral qualms about the justice they were about to deliver. Elijah's role in the deception was crucial, despite his weakened condition. His genuine illness provided a cover for activities that might otherwise have aroused suspicion. allowing Silas to move freely around the compound under the pretense of caring for his brother. More importantly, his apparent vulnerability drew the attention of the silent cousins, who began to pay closer attention to the guest quarters in anticipation of the harvest that was soon to come. The first phase of the operation began at dusk, when the compound's inhabitants were occupied with their evening routines. Silas used tools borrowed from the family's own workshop to weaken key support beams beneath the walkway that connected the guest quarters to the main house. The modifications were subtle but devastating, designed to fail catastrophically under the weight of anyone attempting to cross during the night's anticipated chaos. The sound of splintering wood that marked the beginning of the end came shortly after midnight, when two of the silent cousins attempted to move into position for what they assumed would be a routine capture and processing. The walkway collapsed beneath them with a crash that echoed across the dark waters, dumping both men into the channel where hungry alligators had been gathering for their regular feeding. The thrashing and screaming that followed served multiple purposes in Silas's plan. The noise masked the sounds of his movement as he used the compound's own equipment to isolate and eliminate the remaining family members one by one. More importantly, the blood in the water drove the alligators into a feeding frenzy that would make the channel impassable for anyone attempting to flee or call for help. Jean-Pierre's attempts to restore order were hampered by his inability to understand what was happening to his carefully controlled domain. The patriarch had dealt with desperate prisoners before, but always from a position of absolute power. The possibility that his intended victims had turned his own methods against him left him paralyzed by disbelief rather than motivated by the survival instincts that might have saved him. Tante Eloise proved more resilient than her male relatives, retreating to her kitchen domain and attempting to use her intimate knowledge of the compound's layout to evade capture. But Silas had spent days observing her routines and knew the routes she would likely take in an emergency. When she finally fell, it was into a trap that used her own butchering equipment in ways that would have impressed her with their efficiency if she had lived to appreciate the irony. The systematic elimination of the Vaudry clan continued throughout the night, each death carefully orchestrated to maintain the chaos that prevented effective resistance. Abel's handsome face registered genuine terror when he realized that his charm and apparent innocence would not save him from the justice that had come to claim his family. His final moments were spent pleading for mercy from men who had learned the futility of such appeals during their own time as intended victims. By dawn, the only sounds were the normal sounds of the swamp and the two brothers standing amid the ruins of their hell. The compound that had processed dozens of human beings over the course of decades had been transformed into a slaughterhouse where the predators had become the prey. The letter that Father James Morrison received in February of 1929 contained details that the priest chose not to share with the authorities. Passages that revealed the true nature of the justice delivered in the Blackwater mire. Silas Crow's confession, read in its entirety, painted a picture of events that went far beyond simple self-defense into territory that challenged conventional definitions of both justice and revenge. The chaos that had consumed the compound during the night of fear had indeed resulted in the deaths of most of the Vaudry clan, but not all of the family members had perished in the violent struggle that Silas described in the earlier portions of his letter. Jean-Pierre and Tante Eloise had been captured alive during the final phase of the brothers' assault, subdued and bound with rope from the compound's own supply stores. What followed was not the heat of battle killing that characterized the rest of the night's work, but a cold, deliberate execution that revealed the true depths of the brothers' transformation. The patriarch and matriarch of the cannibal clan found themselves forced to confront the reality of their situation in the same way that their victims had been forced to understand their fate in the hours before their deaths. The conversation that took place in the pre-dawn darkness was reconstructed in Silas's letter with a precision that suggested the words had been burned into his memory by their moral weight. "You beg for mercy," he had told the captured Vaudrais, "the same mercy you showed to the families whose belongings we found in your trophy room, the children whose bones we discovered in your processing pit." But the brothers had not killed their captives in the compound. Instead, they had forced Jean-Pierre and Eloise to make a final journey to the channel, where the alligators waited with the patience of creatures that had been conditioned to expect regular feeding. The march to the water's edge was conducted with the methodical precision that the Vaudrais had once applied to their own victims, a deliberate reversal of roles that ensured the cannibals understood exactly what was happening to them. The letter's most chilling passage described the final moments of the Vaudrais clan's reign of terror. "We did not push them," Silas wrote. "We made them walk into the water themselves, step by step, until the dark current took them and the things that waited there claimed what was owed." The forced march into death was accompanied by a recitation of the names and descriptions of victims whose personal effects had been found hidden in the compound, a litany of the dead that served as both accusation and final judgment. This was not an escape. It was a reckoning, and it would haunt the brothers long after they left the mire. The systematic execution of the captured family members transformed their flight from the compound into something that went beyond survival, into the realm of vigilante justice, a response to systematic evil that employed methods as brutal as those used by their enemies. The brothers' departure from the Blackwater mire marked the beginning rather than the end of their story's impact on the isolated communities that bordered the treacherous waterway. Their flight took them through channels that had been mapped only by generations of trappers and smugglers, men who understood that certain routes were best traveled in darkness and that questions about cargo or destination were both impolite and dangerous. By the time they reached the comparative safety of the Gulf Coast shipping lanes, nearly 2 weeks had passed since the night that had transformed the Vaudrais compound from a functioning slaughterhouse into a monument to frontier justice. The delay between their escape and the discovery of what had transpired in the deep swamp gave nature time to begin the process of reclaiming evidence that might have proven inconvenient to investigators who preferred simple explanations for complex situations. The man who eventually discovered the abandoned compound was a trapper named Boudreau, who worked a territory that overlapped with the Vaudrais' traditional hunting grounds. His initial reaction to the site was one of confusion rather than alarm, since the floating structures appeared to have been damaged by storms or structural failure rather than violence. The walkways had partially collapsed, and the buildings showed signs of flooding and weather damage that obscured the true nature of what had occurred there. Sheriff John Thoreau's investigation of the site was conducted with the thoroughness of a man who understood that certain discoveries were best left unexamined. His official report described the compound as a victim of natural forces rather than human intervention, noting that the isolation and harsh conditions of the Blackwater mire made such structural failures inevitable over time. The absence of the Vaudrais family members was attributed to their decision to abandon the property and seek more suitable accommodations elsewhere. The sheriff's conclusions were supported by the convenient appearance of legal documents that seemed to confirm the family's voluntary departure from the area. A last will and testament bearing Jean-Pierre Vaudrais' signature surfaced in the office of a New Orleans lawyer who specialized in handling the affairs of clients who preferred to avoid official scrutiny. The document transferred ownership of the Vaudrais property to a distant relative who immediately arranged for its sale to timber interests that had no intention of developing the land. But the administrative efficiency that disposed of the Vaudry legacy could not address the stories that began to circulate among the residents of Desolate Point and the other communities that bordered the deeper swamp. The absence of a family that had been a constant, if disturbing, presence in local folklore created a vacuum that was quickly filled by speculation and rumor. Officially, the Vaudry vanished, but in Desolate Point, a new, darker story began to take root. The legend of the brothers who had fed an entire family to the alligators grew in the telling, acquiring details and embellishments that transformed a grim tale of survival into something approaching mythology. The transformation of the Crow brothers' story from historical footnote to regional legend illustrates the power of narrative to evolve beyond the constraints of documented fact. In the decades that followed the events in the Blackwater Mire, the tale underwent countless modifications, each retelling shaped by the storyteller's own understanding of justice, morality, and the limits of civilized behavior. Modern technology has brought new attention to the legend, with internet researchers and amateur historians attempting to separate fact from fiction in the accumulated layers of folklore. Drone surveys of the deeper swamp have identified structural remnants that some claim represent the ruins of the Vaudry compound, though the evidence remains inconclusive and subject to interpretation by investigators whose conclusions often reflect their pre-existing beliefs about the story's authenticity. The moral dimensions of the brothers' actions have proven particularly divisive among those who study the case. Some researchers characterize Silas and Elijah as vigilante heroes who delivered justice to victims of systematic predation when official law enforcement proved inadequate to the task. Others argue that their methods, regardless of their targets, represented a descent into barbarism that made them indistinguishable from the cannibals they claimed to oppose. These competing interpretations have spawned a cottage industry of books, documentaries, and guided tours that cater to the public's fascination with stories that challenge conventional moral boundaries. The Blackwater Mire has become a destination for what locals call legend trippers, amateur investigators whose expeditions into the deeper swamp are motivated more by thrill-seeking than by any genuine desire to understand historical truth. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the story's modern evolution is the persistence of reports from visitors who claim to have encountered evidence of the Vaudry's continued presence in the swamp. These accounts describe pale figures glimpsed through morning mist, the sound of axes chopping wood in areas where no legitimate logging operations exist, and the smell of cooking meat in locations far from any known settlements. Such reports are typically dismissed by authorities as the product of suggestion and imagination, misidentification of natural phenomena by visitors whose expectations have been shaped by exposure to sensationalized versions of the legend. But the consistency of these accounts and their correlation with specific geographic features within the mire has prevented their complete dismissal by investigators who understand that folklore often preserves kernels of historical truth that have been lost to official records. The swamp keeps its secrets, but the story refuses to die, forcing each new generation to grapple with questions about the nature of justice and the price of survival in places where civilization's rules have never taken hold. If you've stayed with us through this journey into the darkest corners of Louisiana's past, if these stories of forgotten justice and terrible necessity resonate with you, then I ask you to subscribe to this channel, because the truth, however disturbing, deserves to be preserved and shared with those who have the courage to confront it. The evidence that supports the legend of the Crow brothers and their final justice in the Blackwater Mire exists in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that can never be completely assembled, but which collectively suggest a truth more disturbing than fiction. Silas's confession, with its detailed knowledge of the swamp's geography and the Vaudry clan's methods, provides a foundation of authenticity that has proven difficult to dismiss despite its extraordinary claims. The official records, sparse as they are, confirm the basic elements of the story. The Crow brothers did escape from a prison transport in July of 1928. The Vaudry family did disappear from their longtime residence in the deeper swamp sometime in the autumn of that year. Bone fragments identified as possibly human were discovered in the area during the following spring, though they were officially attributed to animal remains and filed away without further investigation. But beyond the documented facts lies a more complex question about the nature of justice in places where conventional law enforcement cannot or will not operate. The brothers' actions, if the confession is to be believed, represented a form of frontier justice that employed methods as brutal as those used by their intended victims. Their systematic execution of the cannibal clan went beyond simple self-defense into territory that challenges comfortable assumptions about the moral boundaries that separate civilization from barbarism. The alligators of the Blackwater Mire grew notably fat and numerous in the summer of 1928, according to trappers who worked the area during that period. Whether this population boom resulted from natural factors or from a more sinister source of nutrition remains a matter of speculation rather than proven fact. But the correlation between the Vaudry's disappearance and the reptilian population explosion has provided fodder for local folklore that continues to evolve nearly a century after the events in question. Perhaps the most honest assessment of the Crow brothers' legacy is that it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of survival and the nature of justice in places where traditional moral frameworks prove inadequate. Their story suggests that sometimes the only response to systematic evil is an equally systematic application of violence, delivered with a precision and thoroughness that ensures the threat is permanently eliminated. The Blackwater Mire continues to harbor secrets that may never yield to historical investigation, but the legend of the brothers who fed an inbred clan to the alligators serves as a reminder that justice, when delivered by the Bayou's own predators, is both final and utterly without mercy. Sometimes the only justice the frontier offers is the kind you make yourself, and the only witnesses are the silent, waiting things in the water.